April 5, 1968. 24 hours after Martin Luther King's assassination, and Boston is burning. Not literally, not yet, but every authority figure in the city knows what's coming. The National Guard is mobilizing. Store owners are boarding up windows. And in a backstage office at Boston Garden, James Brown is being offered a deal that will define his entire legacy. Cancel the concert, take the insurance money, go home. It's the safe choice. The smart choice. But James Brown hasn't made a safe choice since he was 4 years old, watching his mother abandon him on a Barnwell porch. And he's not starting now. But what happened during that concert, what the television cameras couldn't capture, would reveal something about James Brown that nobody expected. Because when kids started rushing the stage, when the whole carefully planned broadcast threatened to collapse into chaos, James did something that shocked every politician in that building. He stopped performing. He stepped forward to the edge of the stage. And what he said next, what he did in that moment of absolute tension, would save a city from destruction. But it would also crack something open inside James Brown himself, something that had been sealed shut since childhood. The Boston concert wasn't just about civil rights or community leadership. It was about a man finally, desperately, trying to become the father figure that had been stolen from him. And the price he paid for that single night of heroism would follow him for the rest of his life. If this story resonates with you, hit that subscribe button. We're going deep into the untold moments that shaped music history, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Before Boston, before the Cape Routine, before Sex Machine and Say It Loud and the Grammy Awards, there was a dirt road in South Carolina and a 4-year-old boy who learned the most devastating lesson of his life in the span of 30 seconds. James Brown was born on May 3, 1933, in Barnwell, a town so poor that poverty wasn't an exception, it was the default setting for anyone born black in the Depression-era South. His father Joseph picked cotton, his mother Susie tried to hold together a household with almost no resources, and young James existed in that liminal space of childhood where you're old enough to sense tension but too young to understand what it means. The summer afternoon when everything changed started like any other. James was on the front porch, playing with a makeshift toy he'd built from scrapwood, when his mother walked out of the house carrying a small bag. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't kneel down or offer explanation. She just started walking down that dirt road, her back straight, her steps steady, and when James started screaming and running after her, she never turned around. Not once. His father found him an hour later, still standing in the middle of the road, cried out and hollow, and they never spoke about Susie Brown again. As a teenager, James hustled to survive. After juvenile detention in 1949 to 1952, he discovered his voice could move people. He knew his path, become so successful that nobody could walk away again. In 1954, James met Bobby Byrd, forming the famous Flames. Their 1956 single Please, Please, Please became a regional hit, proving James was worth something. The music industry exploited black artists ruthlessly. James learned to control everything himself. In 1963, he founded Try Me Records, building a fortress nobody could take away. And then came Apollo Theater, 1962, the night that would change everything and set the template for what James Brown could become. The show was recorded live, against the advice of his label, who thought live albums didn't sell and worried that the raw energy of James's performance wouldn't translate to vinyl. But James insisted, because he knew something the executives didn't. His real art wasn't in the studio recordings. It was in the performance itself, in the 3-hour shows where he gave everything, where his voice would crack and his body would collapse and he'd come back for one more song because stopping meant confronting silence, and silence was the enemy. Live at the Apollo was released in 1963 and became a phenomenon, staying on the charts for 66 weeks, proving that black music, black performance, black excellence could be commercially successful without compromise or dilution. James Brown wasn't just an artist anymore. He was becoming an icon. In 1965, James Brown went into the studio with a new idea that would revolutionize American music. He'd been experimenting with rhythm, with putting the drums and bass front and center instead of treating them as background for melody. And he developed a concept he called the one, an emphasis on the first beat of every measure that created a driving, hypnotic groove completely different from anything in R&B or soul at the time. When Papa's Got a Brand New Bag was released in July 1965, it sounded like nothing else on the radio. The song was spare, rhythmic, built on repetition and groove rather than traditional verse-chorus structure. It was the birth of funk, a new genre that would influence everything from disco to hip-hop to modern pop music. James Brown wasn't just successful anymore. He was genuinely innovative, pushing music into territory nobody had explored before. The discipline required was extreme. His band faced fines for wrong notes, and James maintained his relentless pace through sheer force of will. Then 1968 arrived, and everything that James Brown had built, everything he'd become, was about to be tested in ways he couldn't possibly prepare for. By this point, James wasn't just a musician. He'd become a symbol, a representation of black pride and excellence at a moment when America was being torn apart by racial tension. His song Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, released in August 1968, would become an anthem for the civil rights movement, a declaration of dignity and self-worth that resonated far beyond music. But before that song, before James Brown fully understood the weight of the role he was being asked to play, there was April 4th, and Martin Luther King, and a phone call at 3 a.m. that would change everything. When Bobby Bird called with news of King's assassination, James understood the rage that was coming. The music industry went silent. But James had a concert scheduled in Boston for April 5, less than 24 hours away, and a mayor who was about to make a very desperate gamble. Mayor Kevin White knew his political career hung in the balance. His advisors said cancel everything, but White had another idea. Instead of canceling the concert, what if they broadcasted live on public television? What if they gave people a reason to stay home, to watch James Brown in their living rooms instead of taking to the streets? The city would have to eat the cost of lost ticket revenue, nearly $60,000, but compared to the cost of a city burning, it seemed like a reasonable investment in social control. Except nobody had asked James Brown if he wanted to be a tool of pacification, if he was willing to let his art become a political instrument. When the mayor's office called with their proposal, James had every right to refuse, to take the insurance money and go home like every other artist was doing. But something in Mayor White's desperation reminded James of every time someone had underestimated him, had told him to play it safe, had suggested that a poor kid from South Carolina should know his place and stay in it. And playing it safe had never been James Brown's strategy for survival. So he said yes, but with conditions that the mayor's office, terrified and out of options, immediately accepted. James would perform. He'd allow the broadcast. But he wanted creative control, no police overreaction, and if necessary, the mayor himself on stage to witness whatever was about to happen. And so on April 5, 1968, James Brown boarded a plane to Boston carrying the weight of expectations he'd spent his entire life trying to escape. That afternoon, Boston Garden became controlled chaos. Television crews positioned cameras while outside, police stationed on corners. The city held its breath. Backstage, James did his pre-show ritual, taking the medication that kept him energized through performances that would destroy most people's bodies. Bobby Bird came in, and both men knew tonight was different. Mayor White tried giving a speech about civic responsibility. James cut him off, the music belonged to him alone. As the crowd filled the garden, James felt his familiar pre-show terror, am I enough? The lights went down at 8 p.m., and Mayor White's introduction was stilted and formal, a politician trying to navigate a moment that politics couldn't really address. He talked about unity and healing, and the crowd listened with polite patience, waiting for what they'd actually come for. When the mayor finally stepped aside and the band hit the first notes, the energy in the room shifted immediately. This was what Boston needed. Not speeches about healing, but the visceral, undeniable power of James Brown's music, the funk rhythms that made your body move before your brain could catch up, the voice that could scream and whisper and command all in the same phrase. James exploded on stage in pure motion and sound. For 45 minutes, people danced and forgot their grief. The gambit was working. But then something happened that nobody had planned for, something that would either prove the mayor's strategy brilliant or reveal it as dangerously naive. During a particularly energetic number, a group of teenagers rushed the stage. Not violently, not threateningly, just overwhelmed by the music and the need to be close to James Brown, to touch the man who represented everything they wanted to be: powerful, successful, uncompromising, free. It was the kind of spontaneous eruption that happened at James Brown concerts sometimes, usually handled by security guards who gently moved people back to their seats. But this wasn't a normal concert. This was Boston, one day after Martin Luther King died, and every police officer in that building was on edge, trained to see threat in black bodies moving unpredictably, ready to escalate at the first sign of disorder. When those kids hit the stage, the police moved in fast and hard, grabbing, pushing, creating exactly the kind of confrontation that could turn a concert into a riot, that could fulfill every fearful prediction and turn James Brown's performance into the spark that burned Boston instead of the water that put out the fire. And in that split second, James Brown saw his entire life converging into a single decision. He saw the police grabbing kids who looked like he'd looked at their age, angry and desperate and looking for something to believe in. He saw the whole carefully constructed evening about to collapse into chaos that would dominate the news cycle and prove that black people couldn't be trusted in large groups, that gatherings needed to be controlled and suppressed. He saw Mayor White in the wings, frozen, realizing his gambit was about to backfire spectacularly. And James Brown, who'd spent 31 years running from the abandoned child inside him, who'd built an empire on never showing vulnerability, who'd perfected a performance persona so complete that sometimes even he forgot where it ended and the real person began, made a choice that shocked everyone in that building. He stopped singing. Just stopped, mid-phrase, and the band stumbled to a halt behind him, confused, because James Brown never stopped performing, never broke character, never let the audience see anything but the polished, controlled version of himself he'd spent decades constructing. But he stopped. And he walked to the front of the stage, right to the edge where the lights were brightest, and he looked directly at the kids being manhandled by police, and then he looked at the police themselves, and then he looked at the cameras, at the thousands of people watching in their homes throughout Boston, and he did something that nobody expected. He took control. Not by performing. Not by singing or dancing or deploying any of his usual tools of charisma and entertainment. He took control by being human. He spoke to the police like they were rational people capable of understanding nuance, told them to back off, to let the kids go, to trust him to handle his own show. He spoke to the kids like they were his children and he was disappointed but not angry, told them to sit down, to respect the music, to understand that they were being watched by the whole city and had a responsibility to represent themselves well. He spoke to the audience, both in the garden and watching on television, acknowledged that they were angry and grieving, that he was angry and grieving too, but that giving in to violence wouldn't honor Martin Luther King's memory, wouldn't change anything except give people another excuse to dismiss black pain as unjustified chaos. And the entire building went silent, listening, because James Brown had never spoken to them like this before, had never dropped the persona and let them see the complicated, damaged, surprisingly thoughtful man underneath. Mayor White was in the wings watching this unfold, realizing that his political calculation had somehow stumbled into something much more profound than he'd intended. Because what James Brown was doing on that stage wasn't politics. It was leadership of a type that politicians rarely access, the kind that comes from lived experience and hard-won wisdom and the moral authority of someone who's survived things most people can't imagine. James wasn't telling the audience what they should think or feel. He was showing them a path forward, a way to hold grief and anger and still choose not to destroy, to channel all that energy into something constructive instead of giving their enemies the satisfaction of watching them burn their own neighborhoods. And it was working. The kids who'd rushed the stage were sitting down, sheepish but not arrested. The police were backing off, still tense but no longer aggressive. And the audience was seeing James Brown become something he'd never allowed himself to be in public before, vulnerable, real, enough. The concert continued for another 90 minutes, and Boston didn't burn that night. People stayed home, watched James Brown, and chose not to riot. Mayor White would later credit the concert with saving the city, and historians would mark it as a pivotal moment in the intersection of music and civil rights. James Brown received praise from politicians, from community leaders, from other artists. He was held up as an example of black excellence, of using your platform for good, of stepping up when your community needed you. And all of it was true. The Boston concert was heroic, was important, was genuinely effective in preventing violence. But what nobody talked about, what the cameras didn't capture, was what that night cost James Brown personally. That night, James had to become the father he'd never had, giving others the stability stolen from him in Barnwell. It cracked something open inside him. The medication wasn't enough anymore. The distance he maintained from emotional intimacy wasn't working. The constant motion, the refusal to stop and feel, that strategy for survival was starting to fail. After Boston, James became increasingly erratic. Missing shows, firing band members for minor infractions, getting into conflicts with venues and promoters. His marriage collapsed. Bobby Bird tried helping, but James doubled down, more shows, harder work, trying to outrun the emptiness Boston revealed. By 1970, songs like Sex Machine dominated charts while James personally fell apart. His second marriage ended in 1981, destroyed by the same patterns of control and emotional distance. He was developing a reputation for explosive intensity, for harsh discipline with his band, for relationships marked by volatility and chaos. The discipline that had made him a genius was curdling into something darker, a need for absolute control that came from the terror of ever being abandoned again. In 1984, James married Adrienne Rodriguez, and for a brief moment, it seemed like maybe he'd found someone who could reach the scared child underneath the Godfather persona. Adrienne was strong enough to stand up to him, loving enough to see past his defenses. But James's demons were too entrenched, too fundamental to who he'd become. The drug use escalated. The turbulence escalated. And on January 6, 1996, Adrienne Rodriguez died unexpectedly. The loss shattered something in James that had been barely holding together. Unlike his mother's abandonment, which he'd spent decades running from, Adrienne's death forced him to confront the devastating truth that love, no matter how fierce, couldn't protect against loss. His final years saw James become a parody, performing at ceremonies as a living legend who felt like a museum piece. In 1987 and 1992, he won Grammys, but the industry had moved on. On Christmas morning, 2006, James Brown died of heart failure in Atlanta, 73 years old, his body finally giving out after decades of relentless performance and sacrifice. The tributes poured in celebrating his musical innovations, his cultural impact, his role in shaping American music. But very few grappled with the complexity of who James Brown actually was, with the contradiction of a man who could be both heroic and haunted, both visionary and deeply broken. His estate battle lasted 15 years until 2021. His music remains the foundation of hip-hop, sampled endlessly, the literal DNA of modern beats. But all of that legacy building feels oddly beside the point, like arguing over furniture while ignoring the house burning down. Because James Brown's real legacy wasn't money or even music, not entirely. His real legacy was demonstrating both the possibilities and the costs of genius emerging from trauma, of what happens when a society asks someone to be superhuman without ever giving them the support to be simply human. The night of April 5, 1968, James Brown saved Boston from burning by becoming the father figure he'd never had, by giving to a grieving community the stability and wisdom that nobody had ever given to him. It was heroic. It was necessary. It was one of the most important moments in American cultural history. But it was also the moment when James Brown proved he could carry weight that would eventually crush him, when he demonstrated a capacity for giving that he would never be able to turn inward, when he became the man everyone needed instead of the man he needed himself to be. And in the end, that's the tragedy that the tributes and estate battles and musical analyses all miss. James Brown died on Christmas morning, still waiting for someone to come back, still standing on that dirt road in Barnwell, still running from a pain that motion could never outpace. The music lives on, revolutionary and vital and foundational to everything that came after. But the man who made it never got to rest, never got to stop, never got to be enough just by being himself instead of being what everyone else needed him to be. And that, more than any concert or recording or cultural milestone, is the truth that April 5, 1968 revealed, even if nobody was quite ready to see it.